Hello and welcome to our webinar with Emsisoft and Comet Backup. My name is Natalie. I'm the marketing lead at Comet. We are joined by Sarah, who is a malware analyst from Emsisoft, and Mason, who is Comet's CTO. Welcome. Thank you guys both for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we wanted to have this conversation because there's a lot of talk in the space right now about ransomware, malware, and what you need to do to protect yourself as an IT team, as a business, and as an MSP. So let's get into it. I have a few questions for both of you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. So for you, Sarah, to start off, what are some of the top cybersecurity threats that businesses need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think the big one's definitely ransomware, as you mentioned. I think it's probably one of the biggest things that companies are dealing with at the moment. A lot of companies in the news, I'm sure if you're familiar and you kind of pay attention, you see companies getting hit by these $1 million ransoms. So that's quite a big thing to be aware of. And it's definitely at the moment, it's some of the big game hunters. That's what they're focusing on. I think also in general, phishing is quite a big something to be aware of, because it can lead to ransomware, because sometimes if you click on a link, it will then download some malware. If you end up running it, that malware will kind of look at your system and go, oh, this might be something of interest to our partners, that then they can kind of sell the access on. So that's one way how you can actually get ransomware via phishing. But in general, phishing is also quite a big cybersecurity threat in terms of stealing credentials, which can then again be used for ransomware, or can be used for kind of like business email, kind of like trying to get people to fall for scams in terms of that. So I think there's probably the two biggest at the moment to be worried about or thinking about.
So if those are the problems, Mason, what are some of the top steps we should be taking as companies to maximize our data security?
Well, I'm here representing a backup company, so you get one guess as to what my first point is going to be, and that is to back up your data. Shouldn't come as a surprise. Because I am a professional in the backup industry, I can actually elaborate on that one-word answer. Don't just back up. Back up like you mean it. Take it seriously, because it is serious. A lot of companies will think they've got a backup, and it turns out it's only backing up C drive and all their data's on D drive. Or there's a new PC installed in the office and it's not being backed up. This is something you want to find out before disaster strikes. So make sure the coverage is there. If you're a service provider, check in with your customers, phone them up, reach out, ask them if they've added any new PCs or external hard drives recently. They'll appreciate it. You'll get more business. So yeah, just stay on top of the backups. Another way you can stay on top of it is to enable any reporting options, get notified when backup jobs fail, or if they behave out of the ordinary. Make sure you've done a test restore. Make sure you know how the software works. And make sure that your retention policies are configured to keep everything. Definitely at least as long as the worst case scenario might be, and check it all again regularly. Just take backup seriously, because it is a really serious problem that we're dealing with. You asked about maximizing the data security. Backup is an important part of data security. Obviously, it's not the only part. If you want to keep an attacker out, then you need to do everything right, because if any one thing being wrong is an avenue for an attacker to have an entry point into your systems. So just a great big checklist of things to get right. Software updates, staying up to date with your software, strong passwords, generate random passwords with a password manager, use two-factor everywhere, try and get audit trails, use key pairs if you've got that option. And of course, my wonderful co-presenter, use endpoint security software that will stop these viruses, ransomware, malware before it does too much damage to your system.
Yeah, those are all really important points. Sarah, what are some of the most common methods used to infect a system with ransomware?
So I think some of the biggest access point would be OpenRDP, so that's Remote Desktop Protocol. I think that's a really big one. That's something that criminals are actively kind of scanning and looking for. Again, kind of along the same vein, open remote access to the system. So if you have if you're able to kind of connect to a system via VPN, make sure you have a secure password. Make sure you're not using that password anywhere else, because reuse of credentials is a big way how they can get into systems. And also make sure you're keeping your it updated as well, because sometimes they do have vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities can later be kind of used to exploit and be able to get into systems. And again, I think also I mentioned this previously, phishing is also a big one. You like companies will be targeted specifically to try and download this malware, which will then kind of look at the systems and go, these ones are of interest, and then that access can later be sold to ransomware criminals, which can then download their ransomware, kind of get into the system, do their data exfil, anything they need to do. So I think they're probably the two biggest ones at the moment. But also in the news, we've been talking about the Exchange servers. Microsoft's been having a lot of vulnerabilities with them. So making sure if you haven't patched your Exchange server, you do so like right away, because it's really something that ransomware threat actors are really looking at now as a way to get in and to be able to ransom your company.
That's really important. So obviously, antivirus software and preventative measures are super important piece of this. But Mason, why do companies need to do a backup? Like, why is this important? Why isn't it enough just to have, antivirus software and things in place?
Well, obviously, having that in place is really important. However, data loss is just a business-ending event. If you lose your business database and your email history, you're at a significant disadvantage. Backup is what's called the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's reactive instead of preventative. If you're resorting to your backups, that means you've got problems in the present, and in an ideal world, you wouldn't have those problems. So that's where a lot of preventative solutions like antivirus and advanced endpoint security software can provide a lot of value. But in the security industry, we talk about having defense in depth, layering multiple protections together, which is, as long as the protections are independent, there is genuine value from having multiple protections. So if we're talking about ransomware delivered by phishing, the threat has to, it has to break through the email security suite. It has to break through the desktop endpoint security suite. Then it has to break through operating system security, file system permissions, auditing layers. And even if it manages to break through all of those layers, you've still got your backups. So every layer you add makes it safer and safer, and the threat is less likely to get through every single layer of defense that you have. And backup is your last line of defense if it's broken through everything else. And so the backup needs to be rock solid. It needs to be there for you in an emergency. And then with a little luck and a little planning, you can make sure these emergencies don't happen too often.
That's a really interesting way to think of it, as defensive layers, almost like, ninjas trying to penetrate a fortress. Like, you want to have multiple safeguards. You want to have the moat before they enter the castle. I love that.
Absolutely.
What are some of the ways, so we're kind of talking about backup is your last line of defense. Sarah, you guys are more at the front end of that. So what are some of the ways that your products work to make sure they're getting those front layers?
Yeah, so I think in general, we kind of talked about a little bit in the how to maximize your data security, is that you want to have all these frontline layers. You want to have the email protection, you want to have the antivirus or EDR, you want to make sure you're updating your default credentials, make sure you're not reusing them, hardening security like remote access, setting up logs, all that kind of stuff. In terms of our products, so we have our kind of main antivirus engine, which is kind of it scans, and we have signatures, and also we also have a behavior blocker. So if a file is run on the system, then we're able to kind of analyze what it's doing. If any of the behavior is malicious, we'll detect that and alert the user. If it's detected as malicious by our signatures, it will get detected right away. And again, it will get quarantined, and the user will be told that this file is quarantined as malicious. We also have our browser security extension. So that's an optional thing that users can install. It's free, but it kind of gives you that extra layer of security where if you're visiting a malicious site, may it be phishing or malware, that the browser security has kind of got your back. So yeah, that's kind of how our product works to kind of provide those, like one of those layers of security that kind of make up the whole picture of like, if you get hit by ransomware, hopefully, even if it gets through the email security, hopefully the antivirus or EDR will be able to kind of detect it with those different layers.
That leads me really well into my next question, which is about early detection, because we're just, things happen, stuff gets through the cracks. Mm-hmm. So what do you have in terms of recommendations around early detection, monitoring, telemetry pieces that should be in place so that even if something sneaks through, you're catching it really quickly?
Yeah, so I think, again, having email filtering and like having data on the email side is especially important. You want to see where emails are coming from and hopefully be able to filter them before they can even get to your users, and then they end up clicking on them. But if that fails, then having like an EDR or an antivirus in place is especially important, because it gives you that visibility into what's going on in the system, and if anything is running that is malicious that it sees, then it will be able to record that it's happened and kind of send you alert to your client. So that could be in another server, or it could be a web panel that you get alerts from. But also you can set it up so that these products were actually able to remediate, so they're able to kind of deal with the threat and maybe even roll back to the system to a previous state. So it sees that maybe some kind of ransomware is running. It sees that it's encrypted a few files, but it has a kind of ability to roll back, and kind of those files that were encrypted, now they're no longer encrypted. So I think EDRs and antiviruses are really a good thing to have to kind of give you that visibility with the logging into if you do happen to get hit by malware, ransomware, that it can give you that information into how it actually maybe got into the system.
Gotcha. Yeah, all super important. There's a lot of things we know we should be doing, but there's only so many hours in a day, and a lot of times people are taking little shortcuts. The best of us are maybe not doing exactly what we should be doing. Mason, what are some of those barriers to adoption that we see with companies in terms of why perhaps they're resistant to, do I really need to do backup? Isn't it good enough just to copy it to another drive? Like, why is this really necessary? And how do we mitigate some of those barriers?
That's a really interesting example. The first thing I'll say is having one copy is better than having no copies in a disaster. So I'm not going to talk down on someone for at least trying to do the right thing, but you can and should be doing better. I guess you're talking about the barriers to that might stop people from having a backup system in place, specifically talking about backup. And I guess the two main barriers are probably awareness and cost. Awareness is, obviously this is a security discussion. We're all IT professionals. Everyone's heard of backups. But for Comet, we're just a software developer, and we offer software to service providers who can go out and sell a managed IT service to less technical people. And as a non-technical person, you don't know what you don't know, and there's a real difference in the people who have, I'm going to say, experienced data loss in the past. My mother-in-law, this is a few years back now, used to keep all her photos on her phone and of her kids growing up. Just took the photos and treasured them, and one day her phone broke and those photos are just gone forever. Priceless memories lost, and of course now she backs them up. The phone's set to auto sync them to somewhere. But it's that kind of traumatic event that makes forevermore that backup is important. And there's actually an awareness cliff in terms of communicating this painful feeling to others, so that others can learn from our mistakes, so that others don't have to go through data loss themselves. There's a saying that there's two kinds of people in the world, those who have backups and those who haven't yet lost their data. So awareness, that's a really big thing. Yeah, you just don't know what you don't know. Cost would be the other thing in terms of getting clients on board. It does cost some money to license the software, provision some storage, make sure there's bandwidth, the labor cost of setting everything up. And this is something Comet does quite well at price-wise. We're very competitive, but additionally, our strong compression and deduplication allows you to lower your storage cost. Incremental forever lowers your bandwidth cost. Our easy remote management lowers your labor costs. So there's a whole suite of things that come together that come together in that equation, basically. And the major change over the course of my career has been just the complete and utter transitioning to cloud storage. At cloud storage for $5 per terabyte, the trajectory is very clearly in favor of just paying for that. It's still possible to save money by running your own hard drives in a data center or out of your garage. But the economics are very favorable towards cloud storage, and that's kind of the default we're seeing for almost all partners coming on board. So hopefully that addresses the cost side of the equation, and then it's just a matter of addressing the awareness side.
Yeah, and Comet's also backup. We're location agnostic, so a lot of backup software providers, they lock you into using their storage, and Comet doesn't do that, which I think our partners really like. And they can use more than one storage location, so they have redundancy across different locations if they want to make sure that, I have one in AWS and one in Backblaze and one in Wasabi. They can do that. Sarah, I have the same question for you, actually. What are some of the barriers that you guys see in terms of people not wanting to implement these solutions, even though they know maybe I should, but how do you get partners on board?
Yeah, so I think, again, that's the same kind of things of cost, awareness, but also I think it's getting management on board, I think, is one of the most difficult things, especially in regards to actually making changes to security. So if you want to make proper changes to security in like an organization, this step is really necessary, but people often end up finding that they're having pushback or have to make compromises. So I think it's important to be able to explain why you need to make the changes and what the kind of cost of not making the changes would be, and kind of make them aware. Maybe they're not that familiar with ransomware. They might have heard it as a term. Maybe they saw a news article, but they're not that familiar in terms of what it is and how much it could cost their business. So making sure they understand in a way that makes sense to them, because they may not necessarily be technical people. So it can be quite difficult as a technical person to be able to explain things in a way that someone who's non-technical can understand. So I think being able to make the case of this is important, this is why it's important, and having them understand that is essential to be actually being able to implement these changes that you need to make for your organization.
Yeah, putting that dollar figure on it for the CFO or for the CEO, saying like, look, what would happen if you suddenly just didn't have access to any of your business critical data? It's really important, depending on who you're talking to make the argument based on how they see and frame the world. Mm-hmm. Mason, what are some of the steps that we can take to make backups safe from ransomware?
That's a great question. As I was saying before, backups are kind of the last line of defense against ransomware. If the ransomware is broken through all your other defenses, then you do need to restore from backup. Simply having a backup is going to save you 9 times out of 10. What we're talking about now is that last 1 time out of 10 where the ransomware is able to break into the backup storage and affect your backups, or delete the data files or encrypt them, render them useless in some way. The short answer to that is Comet's just a backup software. We need to store data there, and it's not a replacement for those other layers. For argument's sake, let's say your backups are configured to store data on an external hard drive. And if ransomware comes through on that computer and it's got admin credentials, it can pretend to be Comet. It can attach a debugger to Comet's brain and extract the NAS password and do everything Comet does, including deleting files. So, Comet will definitely throw a warning when it goes and looks there next, but, we're just responsible for making those backups, and actually stopping that ransomware from affecting those files is somewhat of an operational concern. But Comet does play nicely with these operational concerns. To defend against this kind of attack, you need one more layer, and that is a security boundary that neither Comet nor ransomware acting as Comet can bypass. And as a storage vendor, if you take a disk snapshot using, LVM, ZFS, ButterFS, VSS, we all know that malware can delete a VSS snapshot. It can delete a VSS snapshot on your PC, but if that VSS snapshot is on the far end of a storage API, if there's a S3 compatible or an SFTP service that's using VSS, at the far end, then no, ransomware can't attack through that barrier. So as a service provider, if you're selling storage space on your hard drives, you can use disk snapshotting at your end to provide this sort of security layer for the customer. And similarly with cloud storage providers, we've worked quite closely with Wasabi recently with their S3 compatible bucket versioning feature. And it's possible with the right settings, you can have Comet have access to this cloud storage bucket, and it can add files and delete files and, do its normal backup thing. But then even if ransomware steals the cloud access keys that Comet is using, you'd still have this bucket versioning feature that can go and undelete at the storage platform level for 30 days or however it's configured. So to answer your question, just another layer. None of these layers can stop ransomware individually, but the more layers you have, strategically, you're much more likely to be able to recover from a compromise.
Are there settings and things within Comet that you can use to kind of lock down the environment and make it that much harder for the ransomware to get in?
Yes. Comet is backup software. Obviously, backup software needs to be able to read every file on the disk. If you're doing a disk image backup, we need raw disk handle access to read every individual disk sector. We need to be able to create and destroy VSS snapshots. We need to be able to start and stop services. So the backup agent needs quite a high level of privileges. We do try and restrict this. Our installer will make a limited permission service account that has the bare minimum permissions needed for backup. So there's some permission risk there in terms of, maybe this abuse of this as an attack vector, but we've got a really good solution in place. It does come down to defense in depth. That's sort of talking about OS permissions. You asked about just being able to lock down the permissions in general. Obviously, application settings within the backup software itself. Comet supports two-factor on pretty much everything. You can force it when logging in. It's defense in depth. It's about the layers. But, if a rogue employee gets on that computer and they know the two-factor password and they're there to do damage and they're there to delete everything, we've got lockdown capability to stop that from happening. If you're a service provider using Comet as your backup platform, you can even remotely disable opening the app. You can remotely disable making any settings changes, do it all remotely yourself as a service provider. So I guess just to answer your question more directly, yes, there's lots of great options here in terms of restricting Comet's permissions. Comet does a lot of it for you automatically, and it's your call as to how much further you want to take it as a service provider, but it's all just layers.
Sarah, once you've been compromised, what are the first actions an IT team will need to take?
Yeah, so I think this is a really excellent question, and one that companies should be thinking about before it happens, because it's all well and good. Kind of when you get hit by ransomware, you're probably panicking. So having a kind of war game plan of like, if this happens, what we're going to do is really important. And also, it should be something that you test out. So I think the first thing that I would recommend is to find and isolate all affected machines that are on the network. So if all machines on the network have been affected, then I would also work to disconnect the whole network. So the reason why I suggest this is because it's like sometimes the threat actors, when they leave the system, they will leave behind malware or they'll have a backdoor onto the system. So this is really important that you don't use a compromised system or network when you're communicating with your kind of insurance providers, the ransomware negotiators, anyone else that's kind of dealing with your case. So some victims have made this mistake, and then they've had a shock that the ransomware actors actually said, "Oh, thank you for this information. We now know how much you're willing to offer us." So it's really important just to, like, it also helps with if you manage to catch the ransomware, the threat actors whilst they're working on it, you're able to kind of isolate the machines that they've been on, and kind of hopefully help make sure that they can't get access to the rest of the network. Maybe that's where you have your backups connected. So in that case, you might be able to save your backups if you don't have any other ones. And also, it's kind of important to be able to identify what kind of ransomware you were hit with, as this allows you to kind of know whether you should, if you end up having to negotiate with them, whether you'll be dealing with data loss if you don't have backups, for example, or your backups happen to be corrupted, or they're missing information, like maybe they haven't actually been running for months on end. But also, it's possible that you might actually be able to decrypt your files for free. So knowing what ransomware you're dealing with can be really good in that. And also, it can give you an idea of how the threat actor is actually able to get in access to your system. So you're able to take these machines once you've taken them offline and have a closer look and see, oh, okay, this is, I've looked at these logs, they weren't encrypted, so I saw that they were actually able to get in via RDP. I see a bunch of kind of communications or attempts to access the system, and then there was one that actually worked. So I think kind of, first of all, take effective machines offline, and then second of all, kind of work to figure out how the threat actors got in and what kind of ransomware you're dealing with, as it will kind of inform your strategy going forward in terms of recovery, and also how you might proceed if you happen to need to pay the criminals. Hopefully not, but in some cases, if your backups aren't working or you don't have backups, then it may be necessary for some companies.
Yeah, those are very important pieces. And that's interesting, too, that in some cases you might not have to pay the ransom if you can get it decrypted for free. So every scenario is not the same, and you need to be aware of what you're dealing with. Really important. Mason, can you talk through some of the hazards of being compromised, and are there things we take for granted until it's too late?
Sure. From a corporate point of view, what actually happens when you get compromised is, recovery is a project, and there's lots of practical stuff to consider. Sarah mentioned, taking that network offline and communicating with insurance and negotiators, but you might have reporting requirements. Talk to your DPO for GDPR, ISO standards, HIPAA if you've got these higher compliance requirements, and obviously the reputation impact on your business is a huge one. But fundamentally, the most important thing is that your organization has the capability to recover. I've worked with some enterprises that had a brain drain over a period of time and lost key capabilities in terms of how their IT systems were set up and worked. And I personally see that as a real risk factor. If you don't have the know-how to get everything back up and running, you will be paying in either time or money. And you've only got a certain amount of runway as a business where you can, be not making any income while your IT systems are down before it starts to, cause a significant existence risk to your business. So one thing I would say is figure out how long you can possibly be down for as a red line, and make sure you can recover from backups faster than that. Disaster recovery technologies, full disk imaging, and being able to virtual boot that full disk image as a VM in the cloud or in another data center, are absolutely fantastic at reducing your RTOs, recovery time objectives here. And then the other thing is just how did they get in? What stops it from happening again? If ransomware is involved, you have to ask yourself some pretty deep questions. Often people will see paying the ransom as a really fast way to get things back online. And it is a really fast way to get things back online. But how did the threat get in? Aren't you just as vulnerable after paying it? And these 2 points really play off each other. If you're still running a Windows Server 2003 box that's vulnerable and old and business critical, and no one knows how it works, and it gets hit by ransomware, there's just no good answers for you. Maybe you can restore from backup, but it's still going to be vulnerable afterwards. So a lot of this is preventative. You should be trying to keep your software up to date. You should have, staff that know how to rebuild your infrastructure. You should have your antivirus, EDR, endpoint security, network segmentation, and so on.
That's really interesting because I think I've thought a lot about the hardware side and the software side of it, but the people side, I'm going to be completely honest, I hadn't given all that much thought to, in terms of maybe you had someone who was really skilled who built the infrastructure and they've since moved on to another organization. Do you have that skill now? So kind of as Sarah alluded to, it's gamifying it, but it's making sure that that game plan is always current. So it's checking in with that game plan throughout, because potentially what was in place a year, 2, 3 years ago is different now, and you have different people within the organization. So really important to update as you go. Sarah, are there some vulnerabilities that companies might not think of? We're seeing a lot of new introduction of the Internet of Things, objects that are connected to the Internet that weren't previously. Are you guys seeing this come through in your space?
Yeah, so I think IoT is an interesting one. A lot of IoT devices are made in China, and over there they don't have such stringent requirements for security. So it's quite often that you'll see in the news that some IoT device actually has quite bad security, that has really weak default passwords that you can't actually change, or they just are using really old technology. So I think connecting IoT devices to the network is always a bit of a risk, especially since it's kind of a new field. You can't really run an antivirus on them. Other than a firewall, there's not too many ways to protect them, especially if the vendor won't offer patches for like these security vulnerabilities. And if they are a small Chinese manufacturer, there's a good chance they won't. Even big Chinese manufacturers don't sometimes, and the government over there doesn't really have to force them to. Whereas if it was US based, the government might go, oh well, this is an issue for us in the US, so they would actually have a bit more, be able to kind of force them to release a patch. I think also another one is, you kind of touched on this with the Windows 2003 server, but having old systems connected to the network that you're not actually aware that are there, or maybe they're running some kind of software that someone about 5 years ago installed to kind of get remote access to use it to manage the system, and this happens to be open to the internet. Not having that kind of inventory or network of what's on your network or what's on these systems can really lead to a lot of vulnerabilities, especially as security vulnerabilities get found. Things need to be patched and out of date. So not having these, and it's fairly common that we find that these companies who are hit by ransomware were hit because they didn't realize that they had these kind of systems they were running this kind of software. So I think if it's time consuming and it costs quite a lot of money, but if you can kind of do an inventory of what's on your network, what each system is running, it's definitely worth it, in terms of like kind of securing the parameter and making sure you don't have any gaps.
That's an interesting way to think about it. I've worked at organizations that have handled it kind of at the two extreme ends. I've been at organizations where, as an end user, I was very locked down. I'd have to take my laptop over to IT to get anything installed. And so that's obviously an organization that's thought a lot about, we need to really know what's getting put on our endpoints. And then I've also worked at organizations where I've been a little bit shocked at, like, you mean I'm allowed to download whatever I want? Isn't that a bit of a risk? So I think it's finding where you are comfort-wise as an organization, how locked down you want the endpoints to be. And even if that feels like an inconvenience for the techs because, oh my gosh, this marketing person is coming over to me all the time because they need something downloaded. This is taking a lot of my time. It's seeing the value in those systems. It's a really important way to think about it as a preventative measure rather than just, oh my goodness, one more thing I need to do. Why can't we just open this up a bit more? Yeah, that's really important. Mason, a little bit earlier, you kind of touched on some of the legal piece of this. Do you mind going into more of those compliance pieces? Can you speak to GDPR and HIPAA? I also know that in the US, there's a compliance measure in place for a lot of businesses where they need to keep files for 7 years. So, what are some of the important things to be considering when you work in these industries that have more stringent oversight?
Yeah. Obviously a really big topic, and I'm not a lawyer, so I will just give the overview and some key points. Let's start with GDPR. A lot of this will also apply to the California CCPA. First, it's important to note that the backup product that we're talking about today is just software. We give that software to a service provider who takes that and runs and operates a service with it. It's actually that service provider who has to deal with the bulk of the GDPR obligations. And what we do as a software developer is make it possible and easy for our service providers to meet these obligations. A big fuss was made about GDPR, and I don't see it specifically as overblown, I guess, but the obligations were drummed up a lot, and actually they're pretty easy to comply with. A lot of the things that GDPR tries to achieve, I just see it as treating others like you would want to be treated. I don't want people to snoop through my files, or I don't want to be unnecessarily tracked. And if I go to a service provider, I want to cancel my account. I want them to delete what they've got about me. That's just basic courtesy, isn't it? So it's not that hard to comply as a service provider with GDPR. HIPAA is a little bit bigger deal, I think, in terms of obviously touches on a lot of the same notes. It's about preserving the patient privacy and confidentiality. And Comet is in a fantastic position here with our obviously Comet has mandatory client-side encryption and optional high privacy mode. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the service provider who has to comply with these obligations. I will say that with Comet, it is absolutely possible for a service provider to achieve HIPAA compliance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, ultimately, you always want to kind of have a lawyer cross the T's and dot the I's just to make sure everything's safe.
Yeah, that's the difference between being compliant and, being potentially compliant, I guess, is whether or not someone's signed off on that.
Yeah. And it's a little bit different, too, if you're like a hospital's IT department where this is your bread and butter, it's what you do every day, you know those ins and outs really well. You potentially have an in-house legal team you can go to that understands all of this in depth. And then being like an MSP where maybe you're trying to service a bunch of different industries all at once, and you can be spread a little bit more thin. So it's just being aware that those are really important pieces to be aware of and make sure you're really covering off your bases so you're not opening yourself up to unnecessary liability. I have a bit more of a technical question for you, Sarah. If I do a backup to a local drive, but I unmount the drive between backups, is my data safe?
So I guess it depends on which perspective you're speaking as. If you're speaking as a home user, or maybe you're managing like a local IT shops or local business, then I think it would be fine as long as you there's an antivirus running on that system, because that should be able to pick up anything that may be hiding. Because we have seen some cases in the past where ransomware would kind of stay on the system and encrypt anything that was kind of plugged in. So it's as long as you have that kind of defense in layers, then I think for a home user, or if you're dealing with like a small business, then that might actually be fine. That might be good enough. But in general, we'd recommend the 3-2-1 approach for businesses. So this can also apply to home users or small businesses. So the idea behind it is you keep at least 3 copies of important files or files in general. So you want to store these copies on 2 different storage mediums, and at least one of them should be located not
Off-site,
on your premises. Yeah, off-site basically. So that could be at a cold center, like a data center, or it could be in the cloud, whatever the business is kind of personally feels like that is the best for them. But yeah, in general, we would kind of stress the idea of having multiple backups of files in different locations, because maybe you have one that's connected to your network, but then if you get hit by ransomware, it's gonna look over that network and it's gonna find that you have a backup connected. So it can be important just to make sure that you have multiple copies, because there's also always failures that can happen. So I think just it's important to stress having more than one copy. And again, what your needs might be very different depending on whether you're a home user, small business, or slightly bigger businesses.
Yeah, definitely. Mason, kind of going into that application, it's one thing to back up your files and folders. Maybe it's another thing to do a disk image or a bare metal backup and take a snapshot of the entire system. But people might not be aware that you can also back up particular types of applications, such as Office 365, or Sarah was talking about how important right now it is to have protection for Microsoft Exchange. Do you want to kind of go into some of the options that Comet has, and why are those important? Because I think a lot of people think, well, my Microsoft Office data, it's in the cloud. Microsoft is taking care of it. Like, Microsoft is big. They're never going to get hit. It's fine. Why is that maybe not the best approach?
So there's a few different ways you can lose data. In terms of, you're right. It is a really interesting situation, because the common situation that we talk about is, a PC gets lost or stolen, or ransomware hits that single PC, or you could have hardware failure, software failure. You need to restore from backups. But generally speaking, we talk about single PC protection. And if your PC is lost or stolen, your Office 365 is going to be okay. But there are ways that risk can seep into your Office 365 account. Sufficiently advanced malware is going to extract your Outlook credentials and delete all your emails and your address book and your meetings, empty the deleted items folder, change your retention settings to keep mails for 0 days, log into Azure AD and delete the whole mailbox with that special option that bypasses the 30-day hold. There's a huge amount of risk that can happen here, because as long as an administrator is able to do these things, ransomware can act as that administrator and do something just as, or maybe it's not even as sophisticated as that. It's just an employee who you've just terminated and they've still got AD access. They can go and delete your mailbox or wreck anything. Having another backup is just common sense. You're right that Microsoft do an excellent job of solving a lot of problems with the cloud service, but it's not foolproof. And even Microsoft themselves do recommend taking a third-party backup.
Yeah, all really important points. Sarah, let's talk about kind of rollout and installation. So if, as a team, we're using scripts to install the Emsisoft software or Comet, why is it important to limit access to the account that you're doing that from? If you're at a really big organization, you might not be doing this, one by one. It's much easier to deploy en masse. So you can kind of talk to that scenario.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to permissions, and I would imagine in most cases that people would make these admin accounts. So that means that they might have more access to the rest of the network than other accounts. So in that case, you have to be really careful with making sure it's locked down. Maybe you have an extra strong password on it, or once it's done, you get rid of the account. Because again, that's kind of what the ransomware actors are looking for. If they can get access to the account that has admin permissions and maybe has access to the exchange or like servers that other accounts don't have access to, then that's kind of gold mine for them, because they can use that to get access to files that you usually wouldn't have like permissions to get to, and some of these can be to cause the most damage to the organization. So I think it's kind of a security risk to possibly have the account still around if you're no longer using it, or if you do need to use it on a regular basis, make sure you have a strong password. Use multifactor authentication. So that's where you have a password, but also you have to confirm you're logging in every time with another device. So then maybe that's your phone. That could be through an authenticator app or text message, or maybe you have a YubiKey or kind of hardware device that you plug into the system, and then that kind of goes, yes, I know that this person is logging in, and it's like it's not someone else. So I think just making sure you have them locked down, good security is pretty important.
Yeah. Mason, I have a quick question about the YubiKeys. Is this something that we should be employing and doing? Is there kind of a big barrier to entry here? Is this something only like really professional people have access to, or is this something all of us can be taking advantage of in terms of a security feature?
I really like that you brought this up because they are really taking off. The U2F keys and YubiKeys. They're somewhat cheap. You can get them for $20 on Amazon, so it doesn't have to be a big deal in terms of supplying your whole organization with them. And a lot of websites and apps do support YubiKeys for multi-factor authentication. GitHub, Microsoft Azure AD, and Comet as well, just off the top of my head.
If someone's not familiar with the concept, do you mind kind of just, if I'm an end user and I don't know what that is, can you give me just a brief overview?
I think Sarah explained it quite well, but basically my impression of YubiKey is a small device that you plug into a USB slot with a single push button on it, and it provides that second factor of authentication, the three main concepts of secure logins being, something you know, something you have, and something you are. And a password is something that you know, but if someone else knows it, then it's no longer a good security factor. So that second factor of something that you have, and whether in this case it's a physical USB device, or if Sarah mentioned, a phone app, that's something that you have, and it provides an independent authentication mechanism that helps lock that system down.
Yeah, really important. Is it also important to, if you have one that you're plugging into your computer, it's a physical device that's maybe not your phone, that you keep, if I'm missing my phone, I notice right away, right? I use that all the time, but if I'm missing a little key, I'm a little bit forgetful. I put things places. Is it important to have a second copy, and how does that work?
Definitely recovery for two-factor is a really interesting point, because we want two-factor to be an important security line of defense. But if you lose your two-factor device, then you're coming to your IT administrator or to your app vendor and saying, hey, sorry, I've lost my two-factor. Can I still reset my password? And as an application developer, it's really difficult to distinguish that request from someone who's just got a leaked password and is actually trying to break into the account. So having a recovery factor is really important. Having, I don't want to say security questions, but just basically any other kind of out-of-band validation that you are who you are, that, in the last resort you can use. But yeah, having two YubiKeys is actually a really common thing. You to keep one on your keychain and another one back at your house, so that if one is lost, then you've got a fallback.
Yeah, definitely. Sarah, what are some of the ransomware is obviously making huge headlines. We're seeing, pipelines being attacked. We're seeing huge software vendors being attacked. Is there anything that's changing because so much mainstream attention is being put on this issue? Obviously, this is not a new issue, but I think there's a pervasive awareness in the general public that maybe wasn't there a year or two ago.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think, especially recently, I guess since maybe 2018, ransomware obviously kind of talked about previously, but it was only when maybe something big happened. So like WannaCry, that was a big thing that even people who aren't familiar with ransomware or security, they even heard about it. So I think cases like that obviously made the news, but I think now a lot more people are aware of ransomware. So I think that's good if you're trying to come to your management and say, hey, we need to make these security changes. You can show them all these news articles, and there's now people have kind of calculated the cost of how much it would be depending on your organization size, if you got hit by ransomware, and like how long you'd be down for. So having those stats and information out there, I think really helps security professionals to kind of get their management on board with agreeing to maybe spend some money and kind of approve these requests for changes. I think it's also been good in that the US government and is kind of making a much stronger stand against ransomware. So that's kind of good. They're kind of being able to support companies, especially those hit by ransomware more. They're taking tips about ransomware a lot more seriously. So that's good. But there is also some bad in it. Some ransomware threat actors, where you're trying to negotiate with them, they use the fact that they're able to kind of put on their blog posts that you got hit. And some companies are really afraid of that. So they kind of use that as a negotiating tactic that, hey, if you pay us very quickly, if you pay us within the next 72 hours, we won't even mention that you got hacked by us. And again, that also goes to if they stole data, for example, they can use that as a negotiating tactic. And it's much more effective when you have news articles and agencies reporting on the fact that you got hacked. The fact that you got ransomed. So it kind of goes both way, where it's a difficult one because there's also a trend of interviewing ransomware actors, and in some ways they kind of get to run the show because a lot of the interviewers won't question them or challenge them on what they say. They just they have a few lowball questions, and they get to kind of advertise their ransomware. So I think sometimes news about ransomware can have a negative impact, and it can go a little bit far into kind of making it look cool or kind of showing off their ransomware. But I think overall, on the whole, people are suddenly like becoming more aware, and that's never a bad thing.
Yeah, increased awareness. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a cost benefit, right? Increased awareness, maybe less phishing or more awareness about things like phishing. You're less likely to click on something suspicious. But that is interesting too, with how the media can play into that, and kind of the strong arming tactics that these bad actors take. And obviously, it's a problem that doesn't just affect the IT department. It's a PR problem. It's a major. There's a lot of risk to brands. Yeah, a big trust issue there. So most ransom is paid in cryptocurrency. According to CoveWave, Bitcoin amounts for 98% of ransomware payments. Sarah, can you talk about and give us an update on what's happening in the industry in terms of traceability with Bitcoin?
Yeah, so all Bitcoin transactions are public, traceable, and they're stored publicly on the Bitcoin kind of network. So this means it's possible to actually see all transactions a certain wallet has received or sent money to and from. So some websites that allow you to send and receive money in Bitcoin, for example, you have to provide identification. So like maybe your passport or your driving license in order to get access to them. So this means that you're kind of, in a lot of cases, you're having to link your real life identity to this Bitcoin address. And so it's possible that if law enforcement are able to see, oh, this Bitcoin address received money from another Bitcoin address, and this money originally came from a victim who paid a ransomware actor, then they're able to go to these vendors and kind of go, hey, can you give us the ID for this person that has this kind of Bitcoin address? And so that's one of the ways that if they're able to kind of follow through the transactions, that they're actually able to identify who these people are. I mean, there's a good chance that whoever owns that Bitcoin address is not actually the ransomware threat actors. Instead, they're a money mule that they've been hired and paid this money. But it is a way that they can track them down. And we've seen this fairly recently that a few people have been arrested, and it's because they were able to get the information of who these people are from the providers of these cryptocurrency. And I think one more thing to mention is this is why some ransomware groups will offer like a small discount, like maybe like 10% even, if you pay with Monero. So this is another kind of cryptocurrency that actually focuses a lot more on privacy. So the idea is that if you do at least 2 transactions through the Monero kind of blockchain, that supposedly, and this hasn't been disproven so far, it should be untraceable. So even if you do pay in Bitcoin, there's a good chance that the criminals will use a dark web service that allows them to kind of convert their Bitcoin into Monero. They'll do a few transactions through there, and eventually they'll convert their money back into Bitcoin, because in order to buy Monero and use Monero, you have to buy another coin first. Monero is not offered by any kind of provider that requires authentication, or rather like you to provide your identification. So that's kind of where the privacy aspect comes in for that.
That's really interesting. So essentially, they're they're laundering the money. They're finding ways to obscure their identities. That's really interesting. Mason, we're getting to the end of the session here, and if I'm an IT professional and I'm in the market right now for backup software, what should I be considering? What should I be looking at? What makes something, more valuable to me than something else?
Backup as a market category has obviously been around for a while, and we're not the only player, of course. But when you really start to evaluate different solutions, a lot of them can't hold up all their promises at the same time. I guess at a minimum, I would be looking for something that has strong client-side encryption, so that data is encrypted in transit, at rest, all the way through to the storage platform. You want it to be incremental and incremental forever, so that you're only ever uploading the change data, and avoiding having to take the bandwidth hit of doing a full re-upload of anything. And the last thing is that you really want to be able to take advantage of cheap cloud storage, especially coupled with client-side encryption. You should be able to trust cheap cloud storage, and it's just a game changer in terms of being able to back up more stuff because you can afford it. It's a huge driver in terms of, as a service provider, getting more deals over the line if you can bring that cost down while still maintaining your margin. But even just these 3 points, client-side encryption, incremental forever, and cloud storage, it's actually really hard to find someone who can do all three at the same time. A lot of vendors will support cloud storage, but only if you periodically do a full re-upload. Or they can do what's called a synthetic full to delta merge a diff into a full file image, but then they can't do that on cloud storage, or they can't do it when it's encrypted. So just these 3 points from me: encryption, incremental forever, and cloud storage. And obviously Comet supports all three of these and more besides, our deduplication, our customer management reporting features. But yeah, those three would be my key points.
Yeah, that's really important to take into account, that you need all three, but you need all three at the same time. Sarah, I have the same question for you. If I'm an IT professional, what should I be looking for when I'm evaluating ransomware software?
Yeah, so I think most antivirus and EDR vendors now support kind of anti-ransomware protection. So I think in terms of that, it's because it's been such a big thing for the past 7 years. So I think most vendors kind of caught up on that. So I think it's more just, do they provide the support you need? Do they provide the right logging? So it's kind of what fits with your environment and provides you with the kind of logging that you need. So maybe you want really detailed logging for environment because you're looking for these malicious changes, but maybe some bigger companies won't need as much logging because they have so many endpoints that if you have really detailed logging on every single everything that changes, then you'll just never be able to look through the data. So having kind of the option to choose whether you want really detailed logging or just to alert on the most important things. So maybe, for example, you would have alerts on, for example, if you saw that there was a carbon stripe beacon had been put on your system. So that's a good indicator that you're going to get hit by ransomware, for example. That's something that you want to know straight away that you need to deal with. So that having the support for be able to get kind of red alerts to anyone who needs to know as part of your software is kind of really important.
Super critical. Yeah. Just to wrap things up, I have one final question. If I'm an MSP, how do I talk to my customers about this? How do I convince them that business continuity is a must-have in today's environment? Mason, do you want to take this, and then Sarah can answer this as well? It's our final question.
Sure. Why is business continuity a must-have? You just look them in the eye and tell them that your mother-in-law broke her phone. That usually works for me. It's just not really a question. I guess if you're having difficulty getting a deal over the line, then I would put it in money terms, like Sarah mentioned before, because the cost of setting up a backup and the cost of doing this is lower than the cost of a breach. Because in a lot of situations, the cost of a breach is something like you go out of business, everyone loses their jobs, you lose your priceless memories. You get a massive fine from the government. It's nightmare material. Of course you need a backup. It's not a matter of if you need one, but when you need one. Without a backup, you are living on borrowed time. Get the best backup service you can. Regularly check to make sure it's working, because it's a big, scary world. And a lot of things can happen to you and your company, and backup is your last line of defense.
Sarah, do you want to talk about why is defense a must-do? This is a non-negotiable.
Yeah, I think Mason kind of talked on a lot of points that I was going to talk about. I think, again, like if you don't have those layers, it's literally a question of when, not if. I think that you're living on borrowed time. If you don't have these layers, you will get hit eventually. And even if you do have these layers, there's a good chance someone's going to try and hit you, and they might be able to make it through at least some of them. But if you have enough layers, and you're making sure that your backups, especially your backups, that even if you do get hit, that oh, if I get hit by ransomware, it's going to take us this long to be able to restore from backups. And I think that's the biggest point to stress, is if that time is too long and you're going to go out of business because you're down for too long, that's where you need those layers, because if restoring from backup is like your last line and it's going to take too long, and then you have a big problem if you don't have those other layers, because again, it is a question of when and not if.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to thank everyone who joined us on this webinar. If you have any further questions, I know you can reach out to Comet at hello@cometbackup.com. We also have a 30-day free trial, so you can try Comet without having to plug in a credit card or anything. Just come give it a test drive. Sarah, how can we contact the Emsisoft team if we have questions?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, you can email at support@emsisoft.com. So if you have any questions, just let them know. Mention that Sarah was the one on the webinar, so they know to kind of ask me or get me to kind of reach out. You can also go to emsisoft.com, and again, we have a 30-day free trial. So if you want to try out our software, you can kind of go and download it. No credit card required. It's just a 30-day trial. So yeah.
All right, there you have it, emsisoft.com and cometbackup.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great one.
Thank you for joining us.